Thank you for joining us for our midweek study. We're finishing up chapter 17 in the book of Matthew, and we've been speaking about Jesus and how he's had these interactions, these confrontations with the religious leaders, and we've also been talking about how Jesus in this chapter 17 and all of the different sections we've gone through, how sonship is vital to what is happening in Jesus' ministry and around him in the people and events that are occurring. So let's start reading in chapter 17. Let's look at verse 24. It says, "When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, 'Does your teacher not pay the tax?' He said, 'Yes.' And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, 'What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?' And when he said, 'From others,' Jesus said to him, 'Then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open his mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself.'" So once again, we see that sonship is really important to what's happening here with Jesus. Now recall that we've talked about this issue of what Matthew is conveying in his gospel. He's conveying that Jesus is the embodiment. He is the Word of God. Everything that the Word of God says, Jesus is the embodiment of. We've also talked about how Jesus is the embodiment of Israel. And the question is, well, how can Matthew be writing about both these things? Well, he can write about both these things because they really should be the same thing. Israel was to be the embodiment of the Word of God. That was the whole point of the covenant at Sinai. When God gave Israel the covenant, he was basically saying, this is who I am. When we look at the 10 Commandments, they say, for instance, you should not lie because God is truth. And so to embody who God is, you shouldn't lie. So those commandments were given to Israel so they might be the embodiment of the Word of God. That's what their job was. They were to be priests to the nations. They were to be the embodiment of the Word of God to the people around him. And yet they largely failed at that. And so everything that Israel was supposed to be and do, Jesus is now going to do those things. He's going to actually be the fulfillment of what Israel was to be. At the same time, Jesus is going to be the fulfillment of the Word of God because that's exactly what Israel was supposed to do. So we have these two different aspects, and we see them in this issue of sonship. You're a son of man, and you're a son of God. That's what Jesus is fulfilling. He's fulfilling both of those things. He is the embodiment of the Word of God, so he's a son of God. He is also physical, he's flesh, and so he's a son of man. He's going to do those two things. Now, what does that have to do with this picture of the temple tax? Well, this is an interesting thing that's happening here. So why is this story here? Well, from a chronological standpoint, I think that it falls where it falls. But you have to remember that things were happening around Jesus every day, and not everything is included in the gospel. So why do we have this story here included? Well, I think it's important for us to see it in context of chapter 17. So, and in fact, it's going to have an impact on chapter 18 as well. So here's the issue. They come to Capernaum, and the collectors of the 2 drachma tax, they go up to Peter and say, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" Okay, does your teacher not pay the tax? So the question here is about any kind of taxes. Now, the fascinating thing is there's all kinds of taxes that need to be paid if you're an Israelite, a Jew. There's you had Rome as kind of the big overarching kind of entity, but then you had these areas were all broken up under different rulers, different governors. And so Jesus, as he's doing his ministry, he's wandering in and out of these different areas. He's wandering in and out of people, different people's jurisdictions, and when you do that, there's taxes to be encountered. There's also temple taxes. There's all kinds of taxes and issues that come up from Jesus. So the issue here is they come up to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax. They went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" They're like, "Hey, why isn't your teacher paying the tax?" And Peter goes, "Oh, yeah, he pays the tax." And so he goes into the house and asks Jesus. He came into the house. In fact, Jesus, it says, spoke to him first before he even had a chance to ask Jesus, saying, hey, are we going to pay the tax or not? Jesus says, hey, what are you doing, Peter? Jesus spoke to him first, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from the others? So Jesus here is saying, he's asking a question of Peter about sonship. A very important question. What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from the others? So imagine being the son of Herod or whatever. Does the son of Herod have to pay taxes to Herod? Well, of course he doesn't. Herod's not taxing his own family. He's not taxing his own kids. He's not doing those kinds of things. Why? Because he's the guy that's receiving the taxes, and his family is an extension of him. And so if you're Herod, you don't pay your own taxes. Herod doesn't pay a tax to himself. That would be foolish. It would be circular. It wouldn't make any sense. And as his sons or his family are an extension of him, they would not pay taxes either. Again, it would be just paying taxes. It would be circular. He'd be paying taxes to himself. And so it's an obvious answer. Now, we would look at it and say, well, that's not fair. Because if the president, he has to file tax returns, and the president's son, he would have to file tax returns. Well, that's because we have a far different view of the nature of law than they did in the ancient world. And the reason we have a different view is because of Christianity. So we have a view of the law being over any human being. So if you're a king, the idea from the Western perspective that developed over time was that even if you're a king, you're under law. You are not the law, you're under law, because the law actually comes from God, and God is above you, and so you're under law. And so in the same way, if you're the president, you are you're kind of the first guy who has responsibility, but you're really not the guy who has the power. If you're a president in the traditional Western view, you're kind of the first citizen. You're not something beyond that. The only thing that's above men is God, and so you're a guy just like every other guy in the country. You're just kind of the first guy, and so it's probably more important for you to pay taxes than anybody else. Because you're to set the example that this law is something that's above all of us and governs all of us, because ultimately it comes from God. Now, if you develop a view of law that doesn't come from God, then you have to start rethinking a lot of that stuff. But that's kind of the Western ideal. Now, back in this day and age, and for Jesus' purposes, this is an important distinction to make, that the guy who was at the top, that he was the guy that the taxes flowed to. He was the law. He could do anything that he wanted to do. And so it's important to understand that that's the way that Jesus is using this example. He's saying, how do the rulers and kings of this world at the time, how do they do things? They don't pay taxes. Their families, their sons don't pay taxes because, again, circular, paying taxes to yourself. Now, why is he making that argument? Well, he goes on and he says in verse 26, and when he said, from others, Jesus said to him, then the sons are free. What is Jesus actually saying here? He's basically saying, Peter, you spoke for me very poorly. Because when you were asked if we paid the tax, the answer is no, we don't pay the tax. Why? Because Jesus is the Son of God. Ultimately, all power, all dominion, all authority are God's. God doesn't pay a tax. God doesn't pay a tax to himself, and God doesn't pay a tax to somebody who's lower down. God doesn't pay the tax. And Jesus, as the Son of God, he doesn't pay the tax either. Now, he'll say here, in verse 27, however, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the fish, the first fish that comes up, and then when you open his mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself. So he says, okay, so we're not going to offend them because they don't, obviously this would create some drama. And he's saying, we're not going to create drama here. My point to you is, Peter, understand what's happening. I'm the Son of God. You back in verse 16, you said that I am the Christ, the Son of God, but you don't understand the implications of this. I am the Christ. I don't owe anybody anything. I don't pay taxes. I don't do that. However, just so that we don't offend these people, go out, grab a fish. The first one you find is going to have a shekel in it, then go pay. And that's what happens. Well, what is he showing through having Peter doing that? He's showing exactly that, yes, he is the Son of God. And when you are the Son of God, everything is yours, including all knowledge, all wisdom, and all power. And so what are taxes to you? Oh, just go grab that fish over there. Fish is mine. What's in it's mine. I'll just hand that to you. Then we won't have any unpleasantness. That's really what's happening here. Now, why is that important? It's important because what Jesus is doing is he's establishing something very, very valuable. That Jesus is going to die. Remember, that's the last section that we covered. Jesus is going to die for the sins of the world. He's going to die for the sins of Israel. He's going to die for the sins of the world. He's not dying. He's not paying off a debt that he owes. He's the Son of God. He doesn't owe anything. And because he's the Son of God, he doesn't owe a debt. He doesn't owe anybody anything. In fact, the world owes him. And yet, even with that position, and even with that authority, and even with that power, Jesus is going to lay that down, just as he's doing here. He's going to lay his rights down, and he's going to serve us. He's going to serve humanity. He is all in for us, even though we haven't been all in for him. Where's the debt? Is the debt belong to God? Has God not been all in for us? No, he has been. The debt's on our side. We haven't been all in for him. And yet, even with that, Jesus is going to lay that down. And why is that important? Well, because everything that we've been talking about here has to do with sonship. And when you're a son of God, everything that the Father has is yours. And you say, oh, great. Oh, great. Well, then cars and mansions and hills and wisdom and knowledge and, okay, yeah, sure. Everything that the Father has is yours. But what does that mean, that everything that the Father has is yours? It also means that everything that the Father has is yours as far as spiritual things, love, compassion, mercy. And so the thing is that what's more important here? What is the inheritance? What's the true inheritance that has true value, that has everlasting value? Is it the fact that, Jesus owns everything, that all, he doesn't get to pay? Are we going to sit here and say, well, I don't have to pay taxes because I'm the Son of God? Or are you going to say, like Jesus, because I have everything that the Father has, I also have his love and his compassion, and I'm willing to lay down all that other stuff because I have the love and compassion that my Father has, and I'm willing to use that. That is the true inheritance. That's the true nature of a son. That's the true mark of a son. And I'm going to lay that down for others. Well, that's the question that we have to ask. And it's important because in chapter 18, what's going to happen is there's going to be a dispute among who among the disciples is the greatest. And Jesus has to be shaking his head saying, you still don't get it. That kind of doesn't show you to be sons of the Father. It shows you to be the sons of men. So that's an important lesson for us to understand. If you want to be a son of God, you're going to have everything that the Father has. But remember, that has to include all those spiritual things: love, compassion. It also means joy. It means peace. It means all those things. But they all come together. You're either a son and you have the full inheritance, or you're not a son and you don't inherit anything. Do you want all of the things that come with it? Do you want the cattle on 1,000 hills? Well, then you have to take the love and compassion that would lay those down for others. That's the way that it works. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.